was a dark morning, with a wind cut like sharp blades, and the snow seemed to swallow everything around. The sound of horses' hooves, riding on the frozen ground, echoed in the vastness of the Scandinavian forest, but it was not a sound of victory. It was the sound of approaching death. In the middle of a vast field of ice, under the merciless gaze of his own leader, a Viking warrior known for his courage and strength, Jörgen, was brought before a crowd of former allies who now considered him a traitor. The accusations were extremely serious, and the Jarl, with his shining and ruthless sword, ordered his execution without hesitation. But there was something unusual about that day, something that fate had in store for Jörgen in a cruel and unexpected way. With his feet stuck to the frozen ground and his soul burned by shame, Jörgen expected nothing more than death. He felt the weight of condemnation on his shoulders, as if the world itself had abandoned him. Every glance cast in his direction was a knife, an invisible cut that stripped him of what was left of his honor. However, what no one knew, not even the Jarl would decide his end, was that Jörgen still had the strength to fight against destiny. In a moment of desperation and contained rage, something inside him ignited. As the blade approached his neck, the warrior, in a last act of resistance, took a step back, escaping the fatal blow. The screams of surprise from the spectators were lost in the icy wind, as he, now marked by betrayal, took a dark path, the path of the damned. Left for dead in the icy forests of Scandinavia, Jörgen had his life spared, but his freedom taken away. Weakened by the blow that nearly killed him and by the hunger that threatened his sanity, he was abandoned in a cruel and merciless world, now hunted not only by savage wolves, but also by the men who had once been his brothers in arms. He found himself locked in a constant struggle for survival. But it wasn't just his body that Jörgen would have to fight. The real enemy was the pain of his past, the weight of betrayal, and the overwhelming desire for revenge. As winter deepened, his journey into the icy depths of Scandinavia would be not just about surviving the attacks that came from all sides, but also about proving his innocence and seeking a redemption he didn't know he deserved. The path of the damned was not a straight road. It was winding, bloody, and full of shadows. And with every step, Jörgen came closer to the only truth that kept him alive. He had to destroy everything he had lost, and that required more than physical strength. It required him to defy his own destiny. Jörgen was born in the heart of the frozen lands of Scandinavia, where the nights are long and winter stretches, like an endless shadow. The village where he grew up was far from any center of power, protected by snow-capped mountains and frozen rivers that cut through the land. His parents, like many others in the region, were simple peasants but warriors at heart. His father, Eirik, was a fearless Viking, a man who spoke with the force of thunder, and whose hand shaped iron with the precision of a master blacksmith. His mother, Freya, had the serenity of a goddess but was known for her unwavering resilience. She spent hours on end forging clothes and armor for men of the village, who went to war or hunted in the dense and treacherous forests. From his earliest steps, Jörgen was shaped by the harsh reality that surrounded him. There was no time for weakness or regrets. At the age of 5, he was taught to hold a knife firmly, to hunt in the icy forests, and survive in a world where cold and hunger could be more cruel than any enemy. His childhood was marked by the struggle for survival, but also by the strong presence of a father who believed that honor and physical strength were the greatest virtues a man could possess. Jörgen looked to his father with reverence, always seeking his approval, but also with a quiet doubt, a sense that something beyond brute strength was needed to be truly great. During his adolescence, the pressure to become an unbeatable warrior intensified. At 13, Jörgen was taken to his first battlefield, a small skirmish against a rival clan that had invaded his lands. The battle was bloody, and Jörgen experienced for the first time a metallic smell of blood and the sound of screams of pain and fury. But for him, the most shocking thing was not the death itself, but the feeling that, despite fighting with all his strength, he was merely repeating the actions of others. War, the struggle for survival, was not just a reflection of bravery, but a prison of fate. He learned to kill without hesitation, to protect his people with the same fervor with which he fought for his own life. But in his heart a shadow grew. He longed for something more than the endless struggle. When he turned 17, Jörgen was formally accepted as a member of his Viking clan, which positioned him as a man in society, ready to defend his land and his honor. During this period, He began to stand out not only for his talent with the sword, but also for strategic intelligence he demonstrated in disputes. He was not only a fierce fighter, but also a thinker, someone who knew when to attack and when to retreat, when to wait and when to advance. His name began to be heard beyond the borders of his village, and he soon became one of the clan's military leaders. However, the fame and respect he gained did not come without sacrifice. Each victory, each conquest, left a deeper scar on his soul. Increasingly, he found himself trapped in a life of violence, waiting for the next battle, the next enemy to be defeated. It was then that his true tragedy began. On a mission to protect a neighboring village against an invasion of Norse bandits, Jorgen had his first taste of betrayal. During the attack, he was seriously wounded and captured by the invaders, who, by a twist of fate, belonged to the same clan that had once been allied with his. When Jorgen was brought before their leader, a man with whom he had shared many victories, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The clan leader, perhaps jealous of his growing power or seeking to secure his own position, decided that Jorgen was no longer needed. In the heat of battle, as Jorgen struggled to recover from his capture, a false accusation of treason was leveled against him. It was said that he had negotiated with his enemies to gain power, that he had surrendered the village without a fight. The accusation was a mortal blow. Jorgen knew there was no truth in the words, but a lie was repeated so many times that the reality soon faded. His own brothers in arms began to regard him with suspicion. The once hero was now a man marked by shame. The Jarl, unable to see beyond what had been told, ordered that Jorgen be put to death. His fate was sealed, or so it seemed. On the eve of his execution, as he lay in a cold cell, Jorgen reflected on everything he had experienced up until that moment. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that what held him most captive was not the accusation itself, but the fact that it had been just another pawn in a game he had no control over. The betrayal lay not only in the fact that he had been betrayed, but also in the fact that he believed he was fighting for something that truly mattered. His ideals of honor and courage began to crumble, like sandcastles, as he faced the cruel reality of a world where the strongest always prevailed, where loyalty and truth were fragile concepts, easily corrupted by greed and the thirst for power. However, what no one knew, not even those who had condemned him, was that Jorgen's strength lay not only in his sword, but in his ability to resist despair. On that cold, silent night, he swore to himself that he would survive. He knew that even though he was condemned, there was still something in his heart that could be restored. There was a fire inside him that, if well fed, could set everything around him on fire and lead to the destruction of those who betrayed him. The path to revenge would be long, difficult, and full of challenges, but Jorgen had nothing left to lose. He knew that fate had marked him, but that he, in turn, could rewrite history. The morning frost cut through the air like a silent poison. The surrounding mountains, majestic and impassive, seemed oblivious to the screams that echoed from the distant village where Jorgen had been branded a traitor. His body was exhausted, his muscles sore from the desperate struggle for survival, but the man inside him, the Viking warrior, still burned with a fire of resistance. The blow that should have killed him had failed, and instead of succumbing to the cold blade of the sword, he had taken one last step, leaping into the shadow of fate. Now, with his chest burning with pain and his ears still echoing with the screams of his own name being cursed, Jorgen found himself thrown into an even crueler journey, an escape that would take him deep into the Scandinavian forest, where even the winds howled like the laments of the dead. The first night after the attempted execution was a nightmare that would never leave Jorgen. The cold, like an invisible enemy, seemed to want to swallow his soul. The wounds on his neck and chest, caused by the blows of steel, stung with every movement. But the fear of being caught by the men who had once considered him a brother drove him on. He no longer had a house, a village, a home. All he had were the biting winds and the vastness of the frozen forest before him. He did not know exactly where he was going, but he could not go back. With each step he took away from the village, he felt further away from his past, from his life of honor and respect. But at the same time, a sense of liberation began to take hold of his spirit. He was alive, and that was all that mattered at that moment. The first few days were a blur of pain, fear, and disorientation. Jorgen knew he could not rest for long. The smell of his blood still hung in the air, and the men of his own clan, now turned into ruthless hunters, would soon be upon him. In the forest, he was a stranger, a fugitive with nothing but the echoes of his own breathing and the sound of the snow beneath his feet. At first, his steps were unsteady, uncertain, his body constantly bending in pain. Escape was not simple. He was not just running from death, but from a weight of his own conscience, from the accusations that had been imposed on him, from the shame that now bore an invisible mark. The sky, which had once represented freedom, now seemed like a prison, with the heavy clouds closing in on him, forming a curtain of ice and wind. In the forest, Jorgen had to learn to be more than a warrior. He had to learn to be a survivor. In the early days, instincts guided him, but they were not enough. He had been trained for war, for battle, but this war was different. The enemy was not a man with a sword, but the unforgiving environment itself. Nature had no mercy, and loneliness was his only companion. For hours, he hunted with precision that grew ever sharper, but the cold and hunger tested his strength at every step. He hunted elk and small game, using the bones of his prey to fashion improvised tools, and learned to search for roots and berries in the snow, but always in constant fear of being found. With each passing day, the isolation began to consume his soul. The silence of the forest grew deeper, as if nature itself were waiting for him to succumb. The winter, which seemed of no end, brought a feeling of helplessness, as if the days and nights dragged on forever. Jorgen, who had once faced the world with indomitable courage, now found himself alone, trapped in his own mind. Doubt, which had never had a place in the heart of a warrior, now invaded his every thought. He began to question everything, his loyalty, his actions, the very reason he had become a warrior. He had been a leader, a hero to his village, but now he found himself exiled, lost in a cold and cruel world. The shame of the accusation of betrayal weighed on him more than the cold itself. He didn't know how, but he felt that his fight would not be just against those who betrayed him. His greatest battle would be against himself, against the pain of being thrown into an abyss he had not chosen. Over the next few months, Jorgen found himself trapped in an endless cycle of survival and reflection. With each passing day, he grew stronger physically, his resilience shaped by the harshness of nature. But he also became more withdrawn, more suspicious, more immersed in his own dark thoughts. He knew that his revenge was coming, but with each night he spent alone in the icy forest, he began to question whether what drove him was truly justice or merely the desire to destroy those who had abandoned him. Revenge, once a hot, burning impulse, now seemed like a double-edged sword, capable of cutting him as much as those who had wronged him. In the midst of his exile, Jorgen also faced a silent and treacherous enemy, his inner nature. Loneliness pressed on him like heavy armor, and the long months of exile forced him to confront the man he was, not just a warrior. There were times when exhaustion made him doubt himself, and he wondered if he would ever be able to return to his land, to his people, to the person he had been before he was condemned. The war he now waged was not only against the men who had betrayed him, but against his own past and the ghosts that haunted him. He had become something different in exile. The man who had once been a leader now saw himself as a specter of what he had once been. And this internal change was the hardest battle of all. The revenge he planned now came at a cost. His soul, the pain of being abandoned by all those he considered his brothers, ate away at him from within. It had been 3 years of suffering, 3 years in which Jorgen, as he drifted further and further away from humanity, drew closer to a new destiny. He knew that in the end, what would remain would be his own justice, the justice of a man who had been wronged and exiled, but who had survived. The man who returned from the depths of the forest, stronger and more determined than ever, was no longer the same Jorgen who had been cast into damnation. He had changed. He now knew that revenge would not be an easy victory, but rather a price to be paid, a cost that would define him forever. When he finally emerged from the forest, Jorgen felt no joy. The biting wind and the gray sky that stretched out before him were no longer enemies. They now represented the strength he had gained, the transformation that had taken place within him. He was ready. The path of revenge was now ready to be walked, and he would finally be free of the damnation that had marked him, not because he had been judged, but because he was able to rewrite his own story. The wind cut through the air like a sharp blade as Jorgen made his way along the snow-covered path toward the village that had exiled him. His boots, now firm and heavy, made a distinct sound against the ice, echoing with each step as a reminder of the long journey he had traveled. He was stronger now, more determined. 3 years in exile had shaped his soul, and with the weight of each battle he had fought in those icy forests, he had known that the time for revenge was finally coming. He had been the condemned man, the traitor. But now, as he gazed upon the village that had once been his home, he knew that his story was not yet complete. Truth, justice, and honor were about to be restored, but that would require more than a simple return. He had defied the very Jarl who had judged him and proven his innocence once and for all. Jorgen would not approach the village as a mere fugitive. He would return as a specter, a shadow from the past returning to confront his tormentor. During his 3 years of exile, he had planned every move meticulously, analyzing the weaknesses and strengths of his former home, his former allies. He knew he could not simply show up at the Jarl's door and expect to be heard. His revenge required more than words. It required action. It required that the Jarl see him, recognize him, and face his own condemnation. Jorgen's strategy was clear. A public combat, a duel where he would prove the accusation of treason false and justice would finally be restored. As he walked along the frozen path, the wind seemed to whisper secrets and promises of revenge. The tall, imposing trees, now bare of leaves, seemed to watch him, as if waiting for the moment when he would finally face his fate. Jorgen felt the weight of winter in every step, but he also felt the strength he had built up over the years of solitude. He was no longer the man who had been thrown into those forests. He was now a transformed warrior, more cunning, more calculating, and with a single mission: to restore his honor and exact revenge on those who had abandoned him. With every step, he felt the desire for justice grow within him. And when the first rooftops of his old village appeared on the horizon, he knew that the showdown was near. When he reached the village, Jorgen made no attempt to hide his presence. He knew he would be seen. He positioned himself in the center of the main square, in front of the Jarl's great house, where his fate had been sealed. The wind whipped his face, and his black cloak fluttered behind him, like a shadow heralding the return of the man who had been condemned. He remained silent for a moment, taking in the sight of the land that had once been his, now seeming strangely distant, as if time had erased his connection to that place. He then raised his voice low and firm, but full of strength. "I am Jorgen, the traitor you threw to death. I have not come to ask for forgiveness. I have come to demand the justice that was denied to me." The message was clear, cutting, and spread quickly throughout the village. The villagers, still fearful of the words they heard about him, fell silent, but their fear did not last long. The Jarl, seated on his throne of wood and iron, heard Jorgen's words and, as expected, was not intimidated. He was a proud man, and the accusation of treason had never been questioned in his mind. However, he could not ignore the fact that Jorgen was there, standing, alive, defying him before everyone. The Jarl knew that his power was at stake, and, like any self-respecting leader, he could not allow his authority to be challenged without response. It was a fight between two men, one who sought justice and the other who clung to power. The challenge was accepted. Jorgen and the Jarl, now face to face, with the entire square watching, were ready for the fight. Jorgen, although physically stronger than when he had left, knew it would not be easy. The Jarl was big, experienced, and had the strength of his position as his greatest asset. But Jorgen was not there to kill, but to prove his innocence, to unmask the lie that had destroyed his life. He had already lost everything: his home, his honor, his land, and now the only thing left was confrontation, the fight for the truth. The fight was a fierce dance between two warriors. The sound of steel against steel echoed throughout the square, like thunder announcing the end of an era. The Jarl, with his heavy sword, attacked with brute force, but Jorgen, with his agility and intelligence, moved with precision. He deftly avoided the Jarl's blows, but without losing focus on his greater goal: to prove that the accusation against him was a farce. Every blow he landed, every dodge he made, was a silent message to everyone around him. He was innocent, and the Jarl could no longer rule under the shadow of a lie. With one deft move, Jorgen disarmed the Jarl, causing the leader's sword to slip from his hand and fall to the ground with a metallic clang. The Jarl, now deprived of his main weapon, tried to regain his composure, but Jörgen pinned him down, placing the tip of his blade against the Jarl's chest without hesitation. The silence in the square was absolute. The villagers stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. Jörgen stood before the man who had destroyed his life, but he did not want death. What he wanted was justice, and justice, at that moment, did not involve blood. "I am innocent," Jörgen said, his voice deep and firm, resonating across the square. "And the true traitors are not among the exiles, but among those who rule with lies." He looked at the Jarl with an expression of restrained fury, but also of great sadness. "You condemn me without hearing my version. Now I will tell the truth." With the strength of his voice and the certainty of his soul, Jörgen revealed the whole truth about the betrayal that never existed, unmasking the Jarl as the true culprit. He told the villagers how he had been wronged, how he had been accused of a mistake he had never committed. He spoke of his fight for survival, of his pain, and of how the revenge he had sought for 3 long years had become more than a simple necessity. It had become a search for the truth. The Jarl, now defeated, with his head bowed, could no longer deny what everyone had witnessed. He did not have the courage to fight, nor to accuse Jörgen of anything else. The truth, like a sharp blade, cut through the web of lies he had built over the years. The villagers, hearing Jörgen's words, began to see the man he truly was. Not the traitor they had been told, but the hero who had been cast into the abyss by falsehood. The clan, with the Jarl's leadership destroyed and the truth revealed, asked Jörgen for forgiveness. They acknowledged the injustice done and welcomed him back. But Jörgen knew his true journey was over. With a distant gaze, he looked out over the village for the last time. He had achieved the redemption he had sought, but he no longer wanted to live among the same men who had judged and then forgiven him. What he sought now was peace, something he could only find on his own journey, away from the shadows of the past. Jörgen turned his back on the village, the weight of his deeds finally lifting. He knew he had accomplished his mission, that he had restored his honor, but that the true path forward was the one he would choose, away from the chains that had bound him for so long. Redemption was complete, and he was finally free. Jörgen headed toward the horizon, the icy Scandinavian wind blowing in his face. He did not look back. The village, his homeland, now remained like a distant chapter in his life, a chapter that, although marked by betrayal and pain, had finally been rewritten by the truth. He had won his honor, his freedom, and his redemption, but now he needed to move on, to seek a new life, far from the shadows of the past. The years of exile and struggle had shaped his soul, transformed his scars into strength and his revenge into a price he no longer wanted to pay. The path ahead was uncertain, but Jörgen knew that no matter where he went, what mattered was that he was free to decide his own destiny. Revenge no longer had any flavor, for the true victory was a peace he had finally achieved within himself. And so Jörgen disappeared into the vast, frozen lands of Scandinavia, homeless but with a feeling that for the first time in many years he was finally at home with himself. The story of his fall and rise, marked by struggle, pain, and redemption, has become the stuff of legend, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, truth and honor can prevail. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.